It was supposed to be a simple family dinner. My son, his wife, and her mother had invited me out, saying it would be fun to spend time together. But from the moment I sat down, I realized this wasn't about bonding. It was a performance. Every sarcastic joke her mother made chipped away at my patience, each one more biting than the last. My son, Ethan, stayed quiet. My daughter-in-law, Claire, just smiled, and I tried to swallow my pride. But then she looked me right in the eye and said it. "If you don't like my mother's jokes, you can pay the bill and leave. Comment where you're watching this from." This is where my story begins. Before we continue, subscribe. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a text from my daughter-in-law. She rarely messaged me directly. Usually, it came through my son. So, seeing her name on my screen was already intriguing. "We're going to dinner with my mom this Friday," it read. "You should come. It'll be nice to spend some time together." I stared at the words for a moment, wondering about the sudden invitation. There was no warning, no mention of a special occasion or celebration. It was just dinner. A part of me wanted to say no. My relationship with her had always been polite, but never warm. We exchanged compliments at family events. We smiled for photos and talked about safe topics, like the weather or new recipes. She was pleasant enough on the surface, but there was an invisible line I could never cross. I always felt like an outsider in her world. Still, I told myself it could be a chance to bridge that gap. Maybe she was trying to reach out in her own way. I texted back that I would go, and she replied with a thumbs-up emoji. No smiley face. No extra words. Just a small, neutral gesture that left me wondering about her true feelings. For the next few days, I went back and forth on whether to dress up or go casual. In the end, I settled on something in between. A navy blue blouse with a simple necklace and slacks. I wanted to look presentable, but not like I had tried too hard. Friday night arrived faster than I expected. I got to the restaurant 10 minutes early. It was one of those upscale places with dim lighting, leather booths, and waiters who moved as if they were gliding across the floor. I saw my son at the table, waving me over. My daughter-in-law was sitting beside him, and across from her was a woman who could only be her mother. She was striking, with perfectly styled hair and a dress that looked expensive. She stood to greet me, her smile wide, but her eyes scanned me as if she were evaluating every detail. "So, this is the famous mother," she said, in a tone that made me wonder if she meant it as a compliment or something else entirely. I smiled politely and sat down. We ordered drinks, and the conversation started with small talk about the menu and the weather. At first, everything seemed normal, but there was something about her mother's voice that made me feel like I was under a spotlight. She asked about my job, my hobbies, even the color I'd painted my living room. It was a type of curiosity that felt more like an interrogation than genuine interest. My daughter-in-law just kept smiling, looking back and forth between her mother and me, as if she were watching a show. I noticed my son wasn't saying much. He was stirring his drink, glancing at me from time to time, and I could tell he was aware of the conversation's undertone. I tried to relax, reminding myself it was just the first few minutes of the evening. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it would get better. When the waiter came to take our order, my daughter-in-law's mother made a joking comment about how I'd probably order something simple since I wouldn't know what half the menu was. She said it with a laugh, but I felt my face get hot. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just her sense of humor, though I saw my son shift uncomfortably in his seat. When the food arrived, I had the strange feeling that this dinner wasn't just about sharing a meal. I felt like I was being watched, even tested. Every answer I gave to her questions was met with a raised eyebrow or a knowing smirk. My daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine, and I couldn't tell if she was enjoying the evening or just letting her mother run the show. The more I tried to engage, the more I felt that this invitation had nothing to do with getting closer. It was starting to feel like a test I wasn't prepared for. The warmth I had hoped to find was completely absent, replaced by a subtle, tense atmosphere. I told myself to stay calm and just get through the night, not knowing that things were about to take a turn that would make this dinner unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. From the moment I set my fork down after the first few bites, I felt a subtle but unmistakable shift in the air. The conversation had drifted from small talk to something more pointed. My daughter-in-law's mother leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, her gaze fixed on me as if I were an intriguing character in a story she was trying to figure out. Her voice had a playful tone, but the words felt carefully chosen to sting. She asked about my past relationships, which felt odd in the middle of a dinner with my son sitting right there. She wanted to know if I had ever been divorced, and if I regretted certain life choices. It was the kind of conversation you have in private with a close friend, not in a public restaurant with people you barely know. I laughed it off lightly, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere, but she found a way to bring it back, making comments that were framed as jokes but carried too much weight to be dismissed. My son kept looking at me, his expression tense. I could tell he wanted to say something, but her presence seemed to keep him silent. Claire just sat there, smiling, swirling the wine in her glass and nodding occasionally as her mother spoke, almost as if she approved of every word. I wondered if this was something they had discussed beforehand, or if I was just jumping to conclusions. But my gut told me I wasn't imagining it. The second jab came when we were talking about hobbies. I mentioned that I enjoyed gardening, that it helped me relax and gave me a sense of peace. Her mother chuckled and said, "Well, that makes sense. Gardening is the perfect hobby for people who don't like to go out much or who don't have many friends to spend time with." She laughed after she said it, as if the humor was meant to soften the blow, but I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I smiled politely, but inside, I was wondering why she thought it was appropriate to say something like that. The waiter came by to refill our drinks, breaking the tension for a moment. But as soon as he walked away, her mother picked right back up. She asked how often I saw my other family members and if I spent the holidays alone. The way she framed it felt like she was digging for something, either a confession or a chance to make another cutting remark. I could feel my patience wearing thin. I'm not one for conflict, especially in front of others, but a part of me wanted to say something. I reminded myself this was my son's mother-in-law, someone I would inevitably have to see again. The last thing I wanted was to create a lasting rift in the family, so I kept my answers short and neutral, hoping she would get bored and move on. She didn't. My daughter-in-law finally chimed in, but not in the way I had hoped. She brought up a story about the first time she came to my house and how I had accidentally burned the pot roast. She told it with a smile, and her mother burst out laughing, adding, "Well, I guess that's why we're eating out tonight." The two of them laughed together, and my son looked down at his plate. It was a small moment, but I felt my heart sink. There was something in the way they looked at each other, sharing this private moment at my expense, that made me feel like a complete stranger in my own family. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but my instincts told me otherwise. This wasn't just a joke. It was something more. Something that chipped away at the foundation of respect I thought we all shared. I took a sip of water and a deep breath, trying to compose myself. I decided to observe instead of react, to see where this was going before I made a move. The night was still young, and if the first 30 minutes had already left me feeling like this, I couldn't help but wonder what the rest of the evening had in store. What I didn't know then was that the worst was yet to come, and when it did, it would leave a mark I wouldn't forget. The conversation was already walking a fine line between polite banter and outright insult, but when her mother leaned back in her chair, took a sip of her wine, and delivered her next line, the air grew even thicker. It was during a discussion about Christmas traditions. I was sharing how I bake special desserts every year, a tradition I started when my son was little. It was supposed to be a light-hearted story, something warm to share, but she twisted it, a smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. She said, "How nice. I guess when you don't have much else to do, you find ways to fill the time." For a second, I thought I had misheard. The words were casual enough on the surface, but the tone was unmistakable. There was no humor in it, just a jab disguised as a joke. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth, and I felt my cheeks grow warm. My son shifted in his seat, glancing at me briefly before looking away again. My daughter-in-law gave a slight smile, as if she were trying not to laugh. I forced a small smile of my own, the kind you give when you don't intend to get into an argument, but also don't want to give the other person the satisfaction of seeing you flustered. "Baking is something I enjoy," I replied, my tone even. "It's not about filling time." My voice was calm, but inside, a small flame had been lit. I had been in situations like this before. where people disguised insults as humor, and I knew how quickly that kind of interaction could escalate. Her mother took another sip of wine and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I was just kidding," she said, her tone light, but her eyes never left mine. "You take things so seriously." It was the perfect trap. Make a hurtful comment, then act as if the other person is too sensitive for noticing. I told myself to breathe and let it go, but the knot in my stomach was getting tighter. The waiter came over to ask if everything was to our liking. I nodded, grateful for the interruption, but as soon as he left, my daughter-in-law's mother leaned forward again. She asked if I had ever considered traveling for the holidays instead of staying home and baking. Her words made my traditions sound small and insignificant, as if my life lacked variety or excitement. My son's hands tightened around his fork. I could see the conflict on his face, the urge to speak up battling with the tension at the table. I tried to change the subject. I asked about her own traditions, how she liked to spend time with her family. She smiled widely and launched into a story about lavish holiday dinners and trips abroad, painting a picture of sophistication and glamour. Every detail seemed carefully placed, as if to highlight the contrast between her lifestyle and mine. My daughter-in-law listened with admiration, occasionally adding her own memories, and the two of them laughed softly as they spoke. When the laughter died down, her mother looked at me and said, "You should come with us one year. It would do you good to experience something different, broaden your horizons." I knew it wasn't a kind invitation. It was another way of implying that my world was small, that my choices were somehow inadequate. The weight of her words sat with me as I pushed food around my plate. It wasn't just what she was saying, but the deliberate way she said it, sliding each comment in with a smile and a sip of wine, as if she had perfected this routine over the years. I started to wonder how many other people had sat across from her and felt that same slow erosion of their dignity, all under the guise of polite conversation. My son finally spoke up, breaking the strange rhythm that had taken over the table. "Mom's traditions are special," he said quietly. "They mean a lot to our family." It was a small defense, but I appreciated it more than I could say. His wife glanced at him but didn't respond, and her mother just raised her eyebrows before changing the subject to something safer. I sat there, holding on to the warmth of my son's words, bracing myself for whatever might come next. The evening was far from over, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the first of many comments that would land like slaps before the night was through. After my son spoke up, I hoped the tone of the evening might soften, that maybe his quiet defense would remind everyone that there were lines you just don't cross. For a few minutes, it almost seemed to work. The conversation shifted to the food, how beautifully the plates were presented, and a funny mishap the waiter had while balancing a tray of glasses at a nearby table. I let myself breathe, relaxing the tension in my shoulders. But the peace was short-lived. Her mother turned her attention back to me, her smile as warm as a cat watching a bird before it pounces. She asked what I did in my spare time, and I told her I enjoyed reading. I mentioned that I often got lost in novels and found comfort in disconnecting that way. She chuckled, leaning back in her chair. "Ah, so you live through other people's lives," she said. "That explains a lot." My fork hovered in midair, and I felt my son tense up beside her. It wasn't just the words, but the way she let them hang in the air, almost daring me to challenge them. I managed a smile, pretending not to understand the implication. "I suppose you could put it that way," I answered lightly, but my voice felt like it belonged to someone else. My daughter-in-law glanced at her mother and smirked, her eyes locking on me for a split second before she took a sip of her wine. It was a look I couldn't quite decipher, but it carried a chill that I felt deep in my bones. The conversation moved on, but I could sense her mother's satisfaction at having landed another blow. She asked about my career history, pressing for details in a way that didn't feel like curiosity, but more like she was searching for a flaw. When I mentioned a period when I had been out of work, she nodded knowingly. "Well, that must have been an interesting time. At least you had all that free time for baking." She drew out the last word, almost musically, as if to link it to her earlier comment and make sure I remembered. I could feel my face flush. There's a special kind of humiliation you feel when someone belittles you in front of your own family, especially in a public place where you can't just leave without causing a scene. I could feel my son's eyes on me, But this time, he didn't say anything. Maybe he thought speaking up again would only make things worse. I couldn't blame him. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The waiter returned to offer us the dessert menu, and I politely declined, though I noticed my daughter-in-law and her mother eagerly discussing the options. As they debated between the cheesecake and the tiramisu, her mother glanced at me and said, "You probably wouldn't like the dessert here. It's not homemade." The smile that followed was wide and toothy, the kind that hides nothing. I looked at her, wondering if she had any idea how transparent her digs had become. I tried to ground myself, paying attention to the hum of the restaurant around us, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of other conversations. But no matter how hard I tried to block it out, her words kept replaying in my mind. This wasn't a coincidence or harmless humor. She was testing me, pushing to see how far she could go before I broke. Dessert arrived, and as they began to eat, her mother launched into a story about a friend of hers who was having trouble keeping up with the times. She looked directly at me as she said it, though she never used my name. "Some people just don't adapt," she said, taking a bite of her cake. "They get stuck in their ways, and then wonder why they get left behind." My daughter-in-law let out a soft laugh, her eyes fixed on the plate in front of her, as if she didn't want to meet my gaze. I knew then that any goodwill I had hoped to build that night was gone. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a difference in humor. This was deliberate. Every comment had been a brick in the wall she was building between us, and my daughter-in-law was letting it happen. I leaned back in my chair, my appetite gone, and decided I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me upset again. But deep down, a resolve was forming. If she crossed the line one more time, I would not stay silent. What I didn't know was that the next thing she would say wouldn't just cross the line, it would shatter it completely, leaving me no choice but to respond. After that last comment about people getting left behind, I watched my son shift uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't eating anymore, just slowly moving his fork around his plate without taking a bite. It was the kind of absent-minded motion people make when their mind is somewhere else. I knew that look. I had seen it before when he was a boy, and I knew something was bothering him, but he didn't know how to say it without making things worse. The difference now was that he was no longer a boy. He was a grown man sitting between his wife and his mother, and the weight of that position was written all over his face. I tried to catch his eye, hoping for some gesture of reassurance. But when our eyes met, he quickly looked away, his jaw tight, and took a long drink of water. I could feel the internal battle raging inside him, torn between wanting to step in and not wanting to cause an even bigger scene. I felt a pang of sympathy for him. This wasn't just an uncomfortable evening for me. It was for him, too. He was trying to balance two worlds, and tonight they were colliding right in front of him. My daughter-in-law seemed completely at ease, chatting with her mother as if nothing was wrong. Every so often, she would dart a quick glance my way, almost as if she were checking my reaction. I couldn't tell if she was silently daring me to respond or simply enjoying watching me hold back. Either way, the dynamic between the three of them was impossible to ignore. When the waiter came to clear the plates, my son leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as he asked if I was enjoying the evening. It was a simple question, but I could feel the weight behind it. I managed a small smile and told him it was fine, even though we both knew it wasn't. This wasn't the kind of conversation we could have in front of them. He gave a slight nod and leaned back, his gaze shifting to his wife. His mother took advantage of the pause in conversation to turn the focus back to me. She asked what my plans were for the weekend, if I had anything exciting lined up. I told her I would probably just stay home, relax, maybe work in my garden. She smirked and said, "Of course. By now, your plants must be your best friends." She laughed, as if she had just said something clever. My son's hand, which had been resting on the table, tightened into a loose fist. For the first time all night, I saw him take a deep breath, as if he were about to say something. His wife leaned over and placed her hand on his arm, a subtle but unmistakable gesture for him to stay quiet. He hesitated, his lips parting slightly, but then he closed them again. I could almost feel his frustration from across the table. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze of polite conversation that seemed to mask the tension. My son barely spoke, answering direct questions but rarely initiating. Every now and then, He would look at me, as if trying to gauge how close I was to leaving. I would give him a small, steady smile, not because I felt calm, but because I wanted him to know I could handle it. When the bill came, the waiter placed it in the center of the table. My son reached for it, but before he could, my daughter-in-law's mother pushed it toward him and said with a smile, "You're the man at the table, aren't you?" She said it lightly, but there was an edge to it. My son didn't laugh. He just took the bill, glanced at it, and placed his card inside without a word. As the waiter walked away, his mother leaned back in her chair, swirling the last of her wine. "Well," she said, "I suppose we can call this a successful night. No one's walked out yet, so that's something." My son's eyes met mine, and in that brief look, I saw the exhaustion, the unspoken apology, and maybe even a hint of guilt. I knew he was torn, but I also knew this was all he could do in that moment. I decided not to hold his silence against him. It wasn't the kind of battle that could be won in a single night, but as I gathered my purse and stood to leave, I also knew I wouldn't forget how it felt to sit there, watching him struggle between protecting me and keeping the peace with his wife's family. It was a kind of discomfort that lingered long after the plates were cleared. We were all standing now, pushing away from the table and gathering our things. My son was holding the small leather folder with the receipt, waiting for the waiter to bring back his card. I thought we were in the home stretch, that I could make it to the parking lot without another incident. But just as I slung my purse over my shoulder, my daughter-in-law let out a little laugh and said, "Well, Mom, you didn't scare her off. She made it through the whole dinner." Her tone was playful, but the words hung in the air like smoke you can't wave away. Her mother laughed too, tilting her head at me as if we were all in on some private joke. I forced a small smile, though my stomach was in knots. "Why would I be scared off?" I asked lightly, hoping to give them an out, a chance to backtrack on whatever it was they were doing. Her mother smirked, her eyes twinkling in a way that told me she was having far too much fun. "You know," she said, "my sense of humor isn't for everyone. Some people just can't take a little sarcasm." The way she said it made it clear she saw no problem with any of the comments she had made all night. My son let out a quiet, almost nervous laugh, but it died in his throat as his wife added, "It's true, Mom's jokes can be a little much if you're not used to them." She looked directly at me as she said it, and there was something in her expression that felt like she was challenging me to admit I'd been uncomfortable. I refused to give her the satisfaction. "I can handle a joke just fine," I replied, my voice steady. That's when her mother leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel more intimate, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Good thing you're tough. Some people would be in tears by now." She laughed again, and this time, my daughter-in-law joined in without hesitation. It wasn't the kind of laughter that pulls you in. It was the kind that shuts you out completely and makes you the punchline. Something in me shifted in that moment. It was as if all the little comments from the evening had built up into a weight on my chest. I realized this wasn't about jokes. It was about power, about putting me in my place in a way that allowed them to smile and pretend it was all in good fun. The worst part was the way they fed off each other, one line leading to the next, their laughter growing warmer with every jab. The waiter returned with my son's card, and he quietly thanked him before tucking the receipt into his wallet. He glanced at me, his eyes searching mine for some kind of signal, but I kept my expression neutral. I wasn't going to let them see how much it was affecting me. We started walking toward the door, the cool night air visible through the glass panes. I focused on the idea of fresh air, of distance, but even as we moved, her mother kept talking, weaving her comments into little stories, each one carrying another veiled sting. When we reached the lobby, my daughter-in-law made one last comment. She gestured to her mother with a smile and said, "If you don't like her sarcastic jokes, next time you can just pay the bill and leave." She delivered it as if it were a perfectly reasonable suggestion, and they both laughed like it was the funniest thing they had heard all night. I stopped walking for a second, the words sinking in. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was a direct challenge. My son froze too, his head snapping toward his wife as if he couldn't believe she'd said it. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, I looked at her and said simply, "I'll keep that in mind." My tone was quiet, almost too quiet, and I saw something flash across her face, surprise, maybe even disappointment that I hadn't taken the bait. We stepped out into the cool night air, and I let the breeze wash over me, soothing the heat in my chest. I knew that night would stick with me for a long time. But more than that, I knew I had reached a point where pretending this was harmless fun was no longer possible. A line had been crossed, and from that moment on, things were going to be different. The four of us walked toward the parking lot, the sound of my heels on the pavement almost louder than the conversation still lingering between my daughter-in-law and her mother. They were laughing quietly about something, their heads tilted toward each other as if I weren't even there. My son trailed a few steps behind them, his shoulders tense, his eyes on the ground. You could tell he was still processing what had just happened at the door. So was I. But I knew that if we left things like this, the tension would just carry over to the next time we saw each other. I decided to try to shift the tone. My gut told me that even though I wanted to snap back, it would only feed into the game they were playing. So instead, I took a deep breath, quickened my pace, and walked up beside them. "What a beautiful night," I said, looking up at the sky. "It's the kind of night that makes you want to take the long way home." My tone was light, almost cheerful, as if nothing unpleasant had happened at all. My daughter-in-law glanced at me, her expression unreadable, before looking back at her mother. "It's a little chilly," she replied flatly. Her mother smiled at me, but it was the same smile she'd worn all night, polished, controlled, and not entirely sincere. "It's lovely," she said, "but you don't strike me as someone who likes to be out late." The comment was wrapped in politeness, but it still had that familiar undertone. I didn't take the bait. "I enjoy good company no matter the hour," I said, and I meant it, hoping my words might make them think I was there to build bridges, not walls. For a moment, there was a pause in the conversation, almost as if they were deciding how to respond. Then my daughter-in-law let out a little laugh, the kind you make when you don't find something genuinely funny. "Well, you'll have to get used to us then." We reached the cars and I pointed to mine, parked a few feet away. "It was good seeing you all," I said cordially. I knew I had to end the evening on a note I could live with, even if it wasn't reciprocated. My son looked at me and gave a slight nod, as if to say he understood what I was trying to do. He walked over to me, stepping away from his wife and mother-in-law for the first time all night. That's when his mother-in-law spoke up again. "Oh, we'll definitely have to do this again. Maybe next time we'll go somewhere even fancier. We can really test your patience with my humor then." She laughed, and her daughter joined in. I forced another smile, though this one was harder to hold. My son's jaw tightened, and I could tell he had heard enough. "That's enough, Victoria," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The laughter stopped abruptly. His wife turned to him, her eyebrows raised, clearly surprised by his tone. His mother-in-law gave an awkward laugh, trying to smooth things over. "I was just joking," she said, but my son didn't respond. Instead, he opened my car door for me, something he hadn't done in years, and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. It was a small gesture, but it said everything. He was sorry, and he wanted me to know it. I got into the car, still trying to maintain my composure. I hadn't lashed out. I hadn't stormed off. I had kept my dignity intact, even though I was exhausted from the effort. My son closed the door, and as I started the engine, I saw him pause for a moment, looking at his wife with an expression that was somewhere between frustrated and disappointed. As I pulled away, I let out the long breath I had been holding since the appetizers arrived hours ago. The restaurant lights faded in my rearview mirror, but the events of the evening remained vivid in my mind. I had tried to shift the mood, to end the night without a bad taste left behind, but deep down, I knew this had been more than just a bad dinner. Something had changed, and no amount of polite conversation could erase the fact that a line had been drawn tonight that none of us would be able to ignore. When I got home that night, I sat in my car for a while, letting the engine hum softly in the silence. The evening replayed in my mind like a series of snapshots, the glint in her mother's eyes before each comment, the laughter that seemed to grow at my expense, the look on my son's face when he finally told her to stop. But most of all, I kept seeing my daughter-in-law's smile. It was never wide or loud. It was quiet, controlled, and calculated. That passive smile never left her face all night, not even when the comments were so cruel that my son shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was the kind of smile that didn't need words. It was approval without involvement, permission without responsibility. She never openly insulted me, not once. She didn't have to. Every time her mother spoke, my daughter-in-law would offer that slight smile. sometimes glancing in my direction to see how I was taking it. If her mother's words were a hand pushing me down, her smile was the silent gesture, encouraging her to keep going. I had always believed that silence could be neutral, but that night I learned it wasn't. Silence can be as loud as words when it's paired with a knowing smile. And that smile wasn't there to ease tension or build bridges. It was the kind of smile that holds the door open for someone else to do the dirty work. I remembered the times before she married my son when she used to visit my house. She was polite, even friendly, though always a bit reserved. I had chalked it up to shyness or the fact that we were still getting to know each other. But now, looking back, I wondered if this was who she had always been, someone who prefers to let others speak for her while she watches quietly from the sidelines. The next morning, my son called. His voice was cautious, deliberate. He asked if I had made it home okay, and after a pause, he apologized not for himself, but for them. He said he didn't know why they had acted that way, that he hadn't expected the dinner to go like that. I could hear the strain in his voice, the frustration simmering beneath the surface. I wanted to ask him why he hadn't said something sooner, why he had let it go on for so long, but I didn't. I could tell he was already struggling enough. Instead, I told him it was okay, that I hadn't taken it personally, even though I had. I told him it was forgotten, even though it wasn't. I spared him the details of how that passive smile had bothered me more than any of the jokes. He wouldn't have been able to defend it without making excuses, and I didn't want to hear them. For the rest of the week, I went about my life. But the memory of that night followed me like a shadow. I found myself replaying moments in my head, noticing things I hadn't at the time. The way my daughter-in-law would lean toward her mother when she spoke, the subtle nods of agreement, the slight curl of her lip when I tried to change the subject. She hadn't been an observer. She had been a participant, just a quieter one. I realized the hardest part wasn't enduring the sarcasm. It was knowing that the person who should have been the bridge between her family and me had chosen to stand on the other side. That kind of silent alignment can hurt more than open hostility because it makes you question everything. If she could sit through a dinner and not once step in to soften the blows, what did that say about how she saw me? By the end of the week, I knew I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. There was going to be a point where I had to address it, not with anger, but with clarity. I didn't want to carry this unspoken tension into every family gathering, and I had a feeling that whether my son realized it or not, he was coming to the same conclusion. I didn't know when that moment would come, but I sensed it wouldn't be long. The next time we were all in the same room, the smiles, passive or not, wouldn't be enough to keep the truth from coming out. And when it did, I would be ready to face it. What I didn't expect was that the opportunity would come so soon, and in the form of a single, deeply personal comment that would make even her smile falter. It happened the following weekend. My son called to invite me over for lunch at their house. He said it would just be the three of us, making a point to mention that his mother-in-law wouldn't be there. I agreed, partly because I missed him, and partly because I wanted to see if things would be different without his mother's presence. I told myself to keep an open mind, to treat it as a chance to reset after the tension of the dinner. When I arrived, the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. My daughter-in-law greeted me at the door with a polite smile that seemed softer than usual. She offered me a drink, and for a little while, everything felt normal. We sat at the table and made small talk about the garden, a new shop that had opened in town, and the weather. I felt my shoulders start to relax. But as the conversation went on, I noticed subtle shifts in her tone. She began asking more direct questions, the kind that venture into personal territory. She asked if I had dated anyone since my divorce, how I spent my evenings, and if I ever got lonely living by myself. I answered calmly, trying to keep the conversation light, but I could feel us drifting into an area I didn't want to touch. Then, without warning, she leaned back in her chair, let out a little laugh, and said, "Well, at least you have your baking and your plants. That's something. Not everyone your age has hobbies to keep them busy." The words were delivered with that same casual smile, but this time, it was just the three of us, and there was no way to pretend it wasn't intentional. It wasn't just a reference to her mother's comments. She was making them her own. I felt my face flush, but before I could respond, she continued. "I mean, it's really sweet," she added. "How you've built a nice little life for yourself. You don't need much to be happy." She said it as if she were paying me a compliment, but it was phrased in a way that made me sound small, as if my existence were nothing more than a modest collection of plants and pastries. My son's fork froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes shot from me to her, and I could see the shift in his expression. He put his fork down and asked, "Why would you say that?" His tone was quiet, but it had an edge I hadn't heard from him before. She looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to challenge her. "I'm just making conversation," she said lightly. "You know, joking around like Mom does." His jaw tightened. "We saw how that ended last time. Do you really think that's a good idea?" The air went still. She glanced at me, maybe expecting me to jump in and smooth things over, but I stayed quiet. For once, I wanted her to sit with the discomfort. Her smile faltered slightly, though she tried to recover it. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said, reaching for her water glass. My son didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, and in that silence, the message was clear. He wasn't going to pretend this was harmless anymore. The rest of the meal was quiet. My son asked me about my week, and I answered, grateful for the change in tone. She chimed in occasionally, but her comments were softer now, almost cautious. It was as if she had suddenly realized the dynamic had shifted, that my son wasn't going to laugh along with her anymore. When it was time for me to leave, my son walked me to the door. He paused for a moment, his voice low. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have stepped in sooner last time." I told him it was okay, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. It mattered that he had spoken up now, and that was enough for me. As I drove away, I thought about how quickly things can change when someone finally refuses to play along. The joke that had crossed the line had done more than just sting. It had drawn a line in the sand. And I had a feeling that from now on, my daughter-in-law would be a lot more careful with her smile when the conversation turned sour. Only 2 weeks later, the four of us were in the same room again. My son called to say they were having a Sunday lunch and that his wife's mother would be there too. He sounded almost apologetic as he explained it was casual and brief, just a couple of hours. I could hear the hesitation in his voice, as if he were bracing for me to say no. I agreed, partly because I didn't want it to seem like I was avoiding anyone, and partly because I wanted to see if the boundaries set at our last lunch would hold when there were more people at the table. From the moment I walked in, the familiar hum of their house felt different. My daughter-in-law greeted me with a smile that felt a little too bright, and her mother was already sitting in the living room, sipping tea. My son seemed relieved when I arrived, almost as if my presence helped him navigate the afternoon. I told myself to stay calm, to walk in with my shoulders relaxed and my voice steady, no matter what happened. Lunch started politely enough. We talked about the weather, a new coffee shop that opened nearby, and some landscaping they were planning for the backyard. I listened, nodded, and even joined in from time to time. For a little while, I thought maybe this would just be a meal. But then, as they were clearing the plates, her mother leaned toward me, a smile on her face that was too calculated to be casual. "Well," she began, "still keeping busy with your hobbies." The way she drew out the last 2 words made my pulse quicken. I felt the heat rise in my neck. My son froze for a second, but before he could say anything, my daughter-in-law jumped in and added, "She means the baking and the gardening. You're certainly dedicated to that." She said it sweetly, but the pause before her words and the slight curl of her lip told me she was fully aware of the double meaning. My heart was pounding in my ears. All the other sounds in the room seemed to fade beneath it, the clinking of silverware in the kitchen, the low hum of the refrigerator. Everything went quiet except for that thumping. I looked at my son, and he was already watching me, his expression cautious. I could tell he was waiting to see how I would respond. I forced a small laugh, though my throat felt tight. "Yes, I still enjoy them," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "They've served me well over the years. I thought that would be the end of it." But his mother leaned back in her chair and said, "How nice. Some people need bigger things to feel fulfilled, but it's sweet that you're content with the simple things." In that moment, I felt something shift. I could see my son's jaw clench, his fist tightening slightly on the table. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm but quiet. His mother-in-law blinked, surprised. "What?" she asked, feigning innocence. My daughter-in-law's eyes darted between them, her smile turning into something closer to a frown. "You've made these little comments before," my son continued, "and I'm asking you to stop. They're not funny, and they're not harmless." The room went silent. His mother raised her eyebrows but said nothing, perhaps realizing this wasn't going to be something she could just brush off. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth as if to speak, but my son turned to her too. "And that goes for you too. We're not doing this anymore." I stayed quiet, partly from shock, and partly because I didn't want to make the moment about me. It wasn't like my son to speak so directly, especially to anyone outside of our immediate circle. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't the same silence I had felt at the restaurant. This one was heavier, more final. The rest of the meal was quiet. The conversation stuck to safer topics, though it felt like everyone was just saying words to fill the space. When it was finally time to leave, my son walked me to the door. He didn't say much, but as I stepped outside, he gave my hand a quick squeeze, just like he had at the restaurant. It was enough to tell me that something had changed, not just for me, but for him too. As I drove home, my heart finally began to settle, but the echo of it reminded me how close I had come to losing my composure. This time, it hadn't been me who set the boundary. It had been my son, and that changed everything. What I didn't know then was that his decision to speak up would have ripples far beyond that Sunday lunch, setting the stage for an even more direct confrontation that neither of us could avoid. It happened just a week after the Sunday lunch. I hadn't expected to see them again so soon, but my son called and said they were going out for dinner and he wanted me to join them. He sounded more relaxed than he had in a while, as if the last confrontation had cleared the air. He didn't mention if his wife's mother would be there, and I didn't ask. I told myself I would go with an open mind and no expectations. When I got to the restaurant, they were already seated. My son waved me over, a genuine smile on his face. My daughter-in-law greeted me politely, and for a moment I thought maybe this time would be different. Then I noticed her mother, sitting beside her, scanning the menu as if she hadn't seen me. She looked up briefly, gave a slight nod, and went back to reading. The meal started quietly. The conversation was cordial, even pleasant at times. We talked about the menu, travel plans, and a recent local event. I relaxed enough to enjoy a few bites of my food without bracing for impact. But as the night wore on, I could feel a shift in the rhythm. The smiles between my daughter-in-law and her mother became more forced, their shared glances more frequent. I recognized the pattern, the subtle buildup of tension that comes before the first jab. It came halfway through the meal. Her mother made a joke about people who never get out much, and my daughter-in-law laughed. It wasn't aimed directly at me, but the implication hung in the air. I ignored it and took a sip of water, but my son noticed. I could see it in the way his eyes darted between us. Then, the conversation turned to dining habits. His mother began talking about how some people are just too sensitive to enjoy a meal out with certain personalities. My daughter-in-law smiled, turned to me and said, "Well, if you don't like my mother's sarcastic jokes, you can just pay the bill and leave." The words landed with a weight that silenced the table. My fork stopped in my hand. My son's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. I looked at her, and she was smiling. Not a nervous smile, but the calm, deliberate one she wore when she thought she was in control. Her mother laughed softly, as if it were all harmless. I set my fork down carefully. "Is that what you think I should do?" I asked. My tone was quiet, but there was no warmth in it. She shrugged slightly. "I'm just saying, if my mother's sense of humor isn't for you, you don't have to put up with it." Her voice was light, but the words were meant to cut. Before I could respond, my son stepped in. "That's enough," he said sharply, his voice stronger than I had ever heard it in public. "That's not a joke, it's rude." His wife's smile vanished, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm just being honest," she said. "You're overreacting." "No," he said firmly, "I'm not. The two of you have made her the butt of your jokes more than once, and I'm done pretending it's okay. It's not." He looked at his mother-in-law, then back at his wife. "You can call it sarcasm or humor all you want, but it's not funny if the other person isn't laughing." The table fell silent. The tension was palpable. Her mother cleared her throat, muttered something about not meaning any harm, and reached for her wine glass. My daughter-in-law looked away, focusing on her plate. I sat in silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because my son had said it all. The rest of the meal was brief. We finished quickly, the conversation limited to safe, neutral topics. When the bill came, my son took it without hesitation, put his card down, and didn't say another word about it. As we stood to leave, he walked beside me to the door. His voice was low but steady. "You are never going through that again," he told me. I nodded, a mix of relief and sadness washing over me. Relief that he had finally taken a firm stand, and sadness that it had taken so long to get to this point. Outside, the cool air hit my face, and I realized I was breathing more easily than I had in weeks. That dinner had been ugly, but it had drawn a line in the sand that couldn't be erased. Whatever happened next, one thing was for sure. I would never mistake those smiles for innocence again. And if they tried it, they would find I was no longer willing to sit silently at the table. Walking out of the restaurant that night, my feet felt like they were moving on their own. My son's words were still ringing in my mind, louder than the street noise around us. For the first time since this uncomfortable dance began, he had stepped fully into the space between them and me, without hesitation and without looking back to see what it might cost him later. That changed something in me. I realized, in that moment, that I had a choice. I could keep showing up, smiling politely, and enduring whatever came my way, or I could finally take control of what I allowed myself to be a part of. When we reached my car, my son stopped. He didn't say much, just placed his hand on my arm and looked at me in a way that said he understood how hard the night had been. There was a weight in his eyes, too, one that told me he was already thinking about the conversations he'd have to have with his wife when they got home. I didn't want to add to that weight right then, so I just thanked him, told him I appreciated what he did, and left it at that. The drive home was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine. My thoughts, however, were loud. I replayed every interaction with them, not just from tonight, but from the months before. There were small moments I had dismissed because I didn't want to believe they meant anything, little digs about how I lived my life, suggestions that I needed to get out more, backhanded comments that seemed harmless at the time. But looking back, I could see how they had all stacked up, creating the situation we were in now. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep walking into situations that were rigged against my dignity. That didn't mean cutting them out completely, but it meant setting a clear boundary about what I was willing to tolerate. If they wanted to see me, it would be on terms that didn't include being a silent target. That night, I decided I would no longer attend any gathering where her mother was present, unless I had an assurance that respect would be the standard. The next morning, my son called. He sounded tired, but not defeated. He told me he had talked to his wife after they got home, and it hadn't gone well. She thought he was being overprotective, that I was being too sensitive, and that he was making a big deal out of nothing. He told me he didn't agree with her, that he had reminded her how different it feels to be on the receiving end of comments meant to shame. I could hear the frustration in his voice as he admitted that she just didn't see it that way. I listened without interrupting. I didn't want him to feel caught between defending me and keeping the peace at home, even though the truth was, that's exactly what was happening. When he finally paused, I told him I appreciated him standing up for me, but that I had made a decision. I explained that I would no longer put myself in situations where I knew I would be disrespected. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I understand." It wasn't an easy decision. A part of me wanted to believe that things could change if I just kept showing up, that maybe, over time, they would run out of ways to make me the punchline. But another part of me knew that change rarely comes when the people causing the harm don't see the problem. I couldn't wait for them to see it. I had to protect my own peace. For the rest of the week, I went about my routine, but my decision stayed in my mind like an anchor. I felt lighter knowing I had drawn that line, but also a little sad, because family should be the one place you don't have to draw lines like that. Still, I reminded myself that dignity isn't something you trade for the sake of appearances. I didn't know when I would see them again, but I knew the next time would be under different circumstances, and if they didn't like the change, that would be their problem, not mine. What I couldn't have predicted was how quickly the opportunity to test that decision would arrive, and how it would push us all into a conversation that none of us would walk away from unchanged. The opportunity to test my decision came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday afternoon when my phone rang. My son's voice was hesitant, that cautious tone you use when you know you're about to ask for something you're not sure will be well received. He told me his wife was having a small get-together with a few friends and that her mother would be there, too. He quickly added that it wasn't a formal dinner, just a casual gathering, and that he would like me to come. Before I could answer, he promised he would make sure things didn't get out of hand. I sat there with the phone to my ear, weighing my words. Part of me wanted to decline immediately, to hold to the boundary I had set for myself just days before. But the way he asked, the quiet plea in his voice, made me hesitate. I could hear that he didn't just want me to come. He needed me to. It wasn't about the event itself. It was about showing her and her mother that I wasn't going to disappear just because of what had happened. I agreed, but only after telling him that if things went the way they had before, I would leave without hesitation. He said he understood. When I arrived, the atmosphere was warmer than I had imagined. A few of their friends were scattered around the living room, soft music was playing, and lively chatter filled the space. My daughter-in-law greeted me at the door with a practiced but polite smile. Her mother was sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine, talking animatedly with another guest. She looked up as I came in, gave me a quick nod, and turned back to her conversation. For the first hour, things went smoothly. I mingled with some of the guests, talked to my son about his work, and even shared a few laughs. But then, as if on cue, the dynamic began to shift. Her mother joined the small circle I was in and started talking about how she loved hosting because it gave her a chance to meet all kinds of people, especially those who don't get out much. The words were vague enough to seem innocent, but the slight tilt of her head in my direction made her meaning clear. My eyes met my son's from across the room. He was in the middle of a conversation, but as soon as he noticed, his expression changed. He excused himself from the group he was with and walked straight toward us. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone quiet but carrying a firmness that got the attention of everyone nearby. His wife quickly stepped in. "There's no problem," she said lightly. "Mom was just making a joke." But my son wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on his mother-in-law. "You've done this before," he said, his voice steady but sharper now, "and I've told you it needs to stop." The room fell quiet. Even the background music suddenly seemed too loud. His mother-in-law blinked, clearly taken aback by how direct he was being in front of others. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said defensively. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." "That's the same excuse you always use," my son replied. "If you don't mean anything by it, then stop saying it." He didn't raise his voice, but his clipped tone left no room for argument. My daughter-in-law shifted uncomfortably beside him. Her gaze flickered between her husband and her mother, and you could tell she wanted to intervene. But she didn't. I just stood there in silence, letting him handle it. It wasn't my fight anymore, it was his. And the way he stood there, shoulders squared and his gaze unwavering, told me that something had shifted in him. He wasn't just defending me in that moment, he was making it clear that this kind of treatment, in any form, was no longer acceptable in his home. After a long pause, his mother-in-law managed a tight smile and said, "Fine, I won't joke like that again." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I was going to get that afternoon. My son nodded, then turned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I gave him a small smile and told him I was. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but the mood never quite returned to what it had been. People kept talking and laughing, but there was a self-conscious quiet in the room, an awareness that something important had just happened. When I left later that evening, my son walked me to the door. "You were right to set a boundary," he told me. "I should have enforced it from the beginning." Hearing that was worth more than anything that had happened that day. I drove home knowing that it was no longer just about me enduring his mother-in-law's comments. It was about my son finally taking ownership of the space between us. It happened just a few days later, when I stopped by my son's house to drop off some homemade soup. I had planned to just leave it at the door, but he opened it before I could knock twice and insisted I come in for a cup of tea. His wife was in the kitchen, moving around quickly, the clinking of cups and spoons filling the silence. Her mother wasn't there, but I could feel the tension before I even stepped inside. My son's expression was calm, but there was a heaviness to it, the kind that comes from conversations that don't end well. We sat at the table, and his wife joined us with 3 steaming mugs. She smiled, but it was a forced smile, more polite than warm. For a few minutes, we talked about everyday things, the weather, the repairs they were finishing in the backyard, but then my son leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. His tone shifted. "We need to talk about the other day," he said, looking directly at his wife. She tensed up. "I already told you. It was a misunderstanding," she replied. "Mom didn't mean anything by it." My son slowly shook his head. "This isn't just about your mother. It's about you, too." The air in the room changed. I could feel the tension, but I stayed quiet, sipping my tea and letting him lead the conversation. "What about me?" she asked, her tone slightly defensive. "You smile and nod every time she makes one of those comments," he said bluntly. "You don't step in, you don't stop her, and sometimes you even add to it. Do you have any idea how that makes my mother feel?" She glanced at me, then back at him. "I'm not responsible for every word that comes out of my mother's mouth," she answered firmly. "No," he agreed, "but you are responsible for whether or not you support it, and the way you've been handling it makes it seem like you're on her side. Whether you mean to or not, you've been taking sides against my mother." I saw her face change then, a flicker of something, maybe guilt, crossing her features before she straightened up in her chair. "I just don't like getting in the middle of things," she said quietly. "You've been in the middle since the day we got married," he said, leaning back. "The only difference is that you've been choosing which side to stand on." The silence stretched between them. I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears, not from fear, but from the weight of watching my son stand his ground in a way I had never seen before. His voice was calm, but there was no doubt about the conviction behind it. Finally, she spoke, her tone softer now. "I didn't realize it was coming across that way," she said. "I thought I was just keeping the peace." "That's not peace," he replied. "That's letting one person attack another while you watch. That's not the kind of marriage I want, and it's not the family dynamic I'm willing to live with." Something in the way he said it left no room for argument. She looked at me again, and this time, her expression was less distant. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. It was the first time she had said those words to me directly. I gave a slight nod. "I appreciate that," I said. I didn't add that it would take more than words to change things. We all knew that. My son leaned forward again, his hands still on the table. "This is what's going to happen," he said. "If my mom is in our house, she is treated with respect. If my mother is in the same room as yours, the same rule applies. And if someone decides they can't follow that rule, they can leave. I'll pay the bill and I'll walk them to the door. But I am not letting this happen anymore." It was a clear reversal of the power dynamic that had been in place for months. In that moment, he had turned the tables, both figuratively and literally, because his words completely changed the course of the conversation. His wife didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, as if realizing that this wasn't going to go away. When I left that afternoon, the air felt different. I knew things wouldn't change overnight, but I also knew the balance had shifted. My son had taken the lead, and for the first time, I felt like I wouldn't be walking into every gathering bracing for the first blow. What I didn't know then was that this new balance would soon be tested in public, and the result would make it clear to everyone, friends, strangers, and family alike, that the rules had changed for good. The public test of this new balance came sooner than I expected. It was a sunny Saturday when my son invited me to join them at a local charity luncheon. He mentioned there would be a few speeches, live music, and a buffet. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his wife's mother would be there. I hesitated for a moment, remembering the promise I had made to myself, but he assured me things would be different. I could hear in his voice that he meant it, so I agreed. The event was held in a bright, airy hall with long tables covered in crisp, white tablecloths. People were mingling, sipping iced tea before the program began. I arrived a little early and found my son near the entrance. He gave me a hug, and I could feel the reassurance in it. His wife joined us a few moments later, smiling politely. Her mother arrived just behind her, as elegant as ever. She greeted me with a nod and a quick hello before turning to speak to someone else. For the first part of the afternoon, everything went smoothly. We listened to several speakers, clapped for the performers, and made small talk with the other guests at our table. My son kept the conversation balanced, making sure to include me without making a big show of it. It was peaceful, almost pleasant. Then, during the buffet, his mother-in-law approached me while my son was across the room greeting an old colleague. She glanced at the plate in my hand and said lightly, "I guess you don't eat like this at home. This must be a real treat for you." It was the kind of comment that might sound harmless to a passerby, but it had the same undertone I had learned to recognize. Before I could even respond, my son was at my side. He had heard it. I saw his expression change, the ease on his face giving way to something more stern. "We're not doing this," he said, his voice low but firm. His mother-in-law blinked, clearly surprised that he would react so directly in the middle of a public event. She started to protest, saying she was just joking, but he didn't let her finish. "You've been told before," he said, his voice still low but sharp. "If you can't speak respectfully, then keep your comments to yourself." A few people nearby glanced over, sensing the tension. His wife quickly came over and asked what was wrong, but my son just said, "Nothing worth repeating." His tone left no room for discussion. His mother-in-law forced a smile and walked away without another word. The rest of the luncheon was polite but subdued. The conversation stuck to safe topics like the weather, the performances, and the food. My son stayed close, maybe to ensure there were no more incidents. His wife was cordial but quiet, and her mother kept her distance. When it was over, my son offered to drive me home. As soon as we got in the car, the weight of the afternoon settled between us. The silence was thick, filled with all the thoughts we were both having but not saying. I looked at him, his hands steady on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I could tell he was replaying the moment in his head, maybe wondering if he had been too harsh, or if he knew he had said exactly what needed to be said. I broke the silence first. "You didn't have to do that," I said softly. "Yes," he replied, without looking at me. "I did." There was no hesitation in his voice, no hint of regret. "I'm not going to let her think it's okay anymore. I don't care if it's in public or private. She knows what she's doing." I didn't argue. I just sat there, watching the familiar streets go by, feeling a complicated mix of pride and sadness. Pride that he had stood so firmly, and sadness that he had to. We drove the rest of the way in near silence, the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal the only sounds between us. When he pulled into my driveway, he finally turned to me. "You've put up with too much for too long," he said. "That ends now." His voice was steady, but I could see the emotion in his eyes. I nodded, not trusting my own voice to stay steady if I spoke. As I got out of the car, I realized the silence we had shared on the drive wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of unspoken promises, and of a quiet resolve that things would never be the same again. What I didn't know was that the next time we would meet, it would be me who chose to speak, and the words I chose would forever change the way they saw me. That night, after the charity luncheon and the heavy drive home, I settled into my living room with a cup of tea. I thought the day was over, that I could let the weight of it dissolve into the quiet of my home. I had barely taken the first sip when my phone vibrated. The screen lit up with an unknown number, but the message preview left no doubt who it was from. It was my daughter-in-law. The first line read, "I think today was unnecessary." I opened it, and a stream of words made it clear she wasn't just talking about the event, but about her husband defending me. She said her mother was embarrassed, that it wasn't the time or place for personal grievances, and that I should have stepped in to de-escalate things instead of letting it blow up. I stared at the message, the tea growing cold in my hands. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, not because I was angry though I was, but because it was all there, laid out in black and white. She wasn't sorry for what was said. She wasn't sorry for how her mother had treated me. She was sorry her mother had been called out in front of other people. For a moment, I considered not responding. Silence can be powerful, and part of me wanted to just leave her with it. But another part of me knew that if I didn't reply, she would take my silence as agreement. So I typed slowly, choosing each word with care. "I understand it was uncomfortable for you," I wrote, "but it has been uncomfortable for me to be the target of those comments for months. Your husband said what needed to be said." I didn't step in because he was right. I read it over twice before hitting send. It wasn't long, but it was direct. Her reply came within minutes. "You're reading too much into it." My mom jokes with everyone. It's just her way. I could almost hear her voice in the words. Light and dismissive, as if the problem could be fixed by labeling it a misunderstanding. But I had lived long enough to know the difference between a joke and a pattern, and this was a pattern. I didn't reply right away. I put the phone down and took a deep breath, a sense of calm washing over me. The truth was, I had spent too much time trying to maintain a relationship with her by absorbing these moments in silence, and every time I let one slide, it just made it easier for them to deliver the next one. My son's defense of me at the restaurant, and then again at the luncheon, had changed something fundamental in me. I no longer felt like I had to bow my head to keep the peace. After a long pause, I picked up my phone and typed my final message of the night. I respect your relationship with your mother, but I expect the same respect from you. I'm not asking for special treatment, just basic courtesy. If that's too much to ask, then I would rather not be in situations where it doesn't exist. I sent it, put the phone aside, and leaned back in my chair. There was no immediate reply. The hours passed. I went about my evening routine, washing the dishes and reading a few chapters of a book before bed. Just before midnight, my phone buzzed again. The message was short. Understood. No apology, no attempt to argue, just one word that told me she had heard me, even if she didn't like it. Lying in bed that night, I thought about how different things were compared to a few months ago. Back then, I would have read a message like hers and doubted myself, wondering if I was being too sensitive or if I had taken offense too quickly. But now, with the clarity my son's unwavering support had given me, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I knew my own boundaries, and I knew I had the right to enforce them. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized something important. Boundaries don't have to be shouted to be effective. Sometimes, they're drawn quietly in a late-night text exchange, and they're held just as firmly. What I didn't know was that the next time we were all together, those boundaries would be tested in a way that would force me to speak up, out loud, in front of everyone, with no chance of backing down. The test came the following weekend. My son called and said they were having a family dinner at their house. His tone was cautious, almost rehearsed, as if he had been thinking about how to phrase it. He said it would be him, his wife, her mother, and me, no extra guests, no distractions. He called it a chance to clear the air. As soon as he said those words, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal dinner. It was going to be one of those nights where every word matters, and every silence says even more. I considered saying no. Part of me wanted to hold on to the quiet satisfaction I had felt after drawing my lines in that text message. But another part of me knew that avoiding this conversation would only postpone it. So I agreed, even as my stomach tied itself in knots at the thought of sitting across from her mother again. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense before we even sat down. My son greeted me warmly, but his eyes had the same intensity they'd had after the luncheon. My daughter-in-law said hello politely, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Her mother was already at the table, sipping water, her posture ramrod straight and her expression unreadable. We started eating almost immediately, as if keeping our mouths busy could delay what was coming. For the first few minutes, the conversation stuck to safe topics: how the roast turned out, the weather, a brief mention of a movie they had seen the night before. But as soon as the plates were half empty, my son put his fork down and leaned forward. "All right," he said quietly. "We need to talk about how things have been going, and we need to do it without pretending everything is fine." His wife glanced at him, then at her mother, then back down at her plate. Her mother folded her hands in her lap and waited. My son started by recounting what had happened at the luncheon, making it clear that he felt her comment had crossed a line. He spoke calmly, but there was no mistaking the firmness in his voice. "I've told you this before," he said to her, "and I'll say it again. I don't care if you call it sarcasm or humor, if it's at someone else's expense and they're not laughing. It's not a joke." Her mother's lips tightened into a thin line. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said. "It's just my way. I've always joked like that. And I'm telling you, it doesn't work here," my son replied. "You are welcome in our home, but you need to respect everyone at this table, including my mother." There was a pause. And then my daughter-in-law spoke for the first time, her voice quiet, but her words carrying weight. "I think you're making a bigger deal out of this than it is," she said. "Mom and I have our way of talking, and it might not be for everyone, but that doesn't mean it's cruel. I felt the heat rise in my chest. Up to this point, I had stayed silent, letting my son speak for both of us, but her words were the opening I needed. It's not about whether you think it's cruel, I said, my voice steady. It's about how it feels to the person on the receiving end. And I'm telling you, it doesn't feel like a joke. It feels like I'm being singled out. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, she didn't respond. My son's gaze shifted between us, waiting to see what she would say. Finally, she let out a breath and said, I didn't realize it was coming across that way. Well, now you do, my son said quickly. So let's agree that it stops here. After that, the room fell silent. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. No one made small talk. No one tried to smooth over the discomfort. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. When the meal was over, I helped clear the table. My daughter-in-law offered to dry while I washed, and though we worked side by side, the air between us was still tense. There were no more digs or double-meaning smiles, just the sound of plates and running water. When I left that night, my son walked me to the door. It needed to happen, he said quietly. I nodded, feeling both exhausted and strangely relieved. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first time everything had been laid out in the open, with no one shying away from the truth. What I didn't know then was that this dinner was only the beginning. The next time we would see each other, her mother would test the boundaries once more, but this time, it would be me who responded in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. 2 weeks after the family dinner, my son called again. He told me his wife's mother wanted to apologize. The words sounded simple, but his tone told me this wasn't going to be as straightforward as it seemed. He explained that it was his wife's idea, that she had said it would be good to clear the air once and for all. I could hear the hope in his voice, maybe even relief at the thought of putting all of this behind them. I wanted to believe it, too, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this apology might be more about appearances than sincerity. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop downtown. It was neutral ground, bright and open, with the sounds of espresso machines and soft music, making it feel less charged than meeting at either of our homes. I arrived first and chose a table by the window. A few minutes later, she walked in, elegantly dressed as always, her posture straight and her face unreadable. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give a stranger you're about to have a polite conversation with, not someone you want to make amends with. After ordering our coffees, she got right to the point. Well, she began, folding her hands primly on the table. I understand there's been some tension lately, and I want to apologize if you took my comments the wrong way. The words landed exactly as I had feared. It wasn't an apology, it was a gentle reframing of the problem, making it about my reaction rather than her behavior. I didn't respond right away, letting the pause stretch just long enough for her to shift slightly in her seat. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully, but I need to be clear that this isn't about me taking things the wrong way. It's about how they were said and how they made me feel. She nodded slowly. Her lips curved into a practiced half-smile. I see, she replied, though her tone told me she didn't. It's just that I've always been sarcastic. People who know me well understand that. I never mean to hurt anyone. That may be true, I said, keeping my voice steady. But when someone tells you that something hurts, the intent doesn't erase the impact. For the first time, her smile faded. She looked out the window for a moment before her eyes met mine again. Well, I suppose I can try to be more careful, she said. But you have to understand, I'm not going to change who I am. I've been this way my whole life. There it was again, that subtle refusal to take real responsibility. In that moment, I knew this meeting wasn't about her fixing anything. It was about checking a box so she could say she tried. Still, I reminded myself that sometimes you have to accept the effort for what it is, even if it's not what you had hoped for. We finished our coffees with small talk about the weather, the local news, and the pastries at the coffee shop. The conversation was cordial but shallow, like tracing paper over a page of unspoken truths. When we stood to leave, she gave me that same polite smile and said, "Well, I'm glad we could talk." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much more without revealing the frustration simmering beneath the surface. We walked out together and parted ways in the parking lot. On the drive home, I thought about how my son would ask me how it went. I knew I would tell him that she had apologized, but I would also tell him the truth that it wasn't the kind of apology that changes things. It was the kind of apology that keeps the peace on the surface, but leaves the cracks underneath untouched. By the time I got home, I had made an important decision. I didn't need her to like me or agree with me. I just needed her to understand that there were lines she could not cross without consequences. If that understanding came through a genuine change in her behavior, all the better. But if it came from me walking away when the lines were crossed, then so be it. What I couldn't have known was that the next family gathering would put that resolve into practice sooner than I imagined. And this time, I wouldn't wait for anyone to speak for me. The next family gathering was a Sunday barbecue at my son's house. It was the first time I had seen his wife's mother since our meeting at the coffee shop. I went without any illusions. Her so-called apology was still fresh in my mind, and I knew better than to expect a sudden change. Still, I reminded myself of the promise I had made in the car that day. I was no longer going to let things slide for the sake of appearances. If a line was crossed, I would address it right then and there. When I arrived, the backyard was filled with the smell of grilled chicken and the sound of lively conversation. My son was at the grill, flipping skewers and smiling as he greeted me. His wife was setting salads on the table, her manner polite but brisk. Her mother was sitting in the shade of the pergola, chatting with one of the neighbors. She looked up as I approached, gave a brief nod, and turned back to her conversation. For the first 30 minutes, things went smoothly. I helped set out plates, refilled drinks, and made small talk with some of the guests. I noticed her mother watching me from time to time, as if she were waiting for the right moment. It came during a lively conversation about gardening. One of the neighbors mentioned how much work it could be, and her mother laughed and said, "Well, I suppose if you don't have much else going on, tending to plants keeps you busy." It was an almost identical comment to one she had made months before, and for a moment, I felt that familiar heat in my chest, but this time I didn't swallow it. I looked directly at her and said, "Actually, I have plenty going on. Gardening is something I make time for because it's important to me. And I'd appreciate it if we could keep this conversation respectful." The mood around the table shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but people noticed. My son paused by the grill, a look on his face that was somewhere between surprised and proud. His wife stopped arranging the dishes for a second before continuing. Her mother's smile tightened, but she didn't reply. She just took a sip of her drink and looked away. I didn't push it further. I had said what needed to be said, and I left it at that. There were no raised voices, no drawn-out arguments, just a clear boundary set in front of others. And it was enough. For the rest of the afternoon, she kept her distance. There were no more backhanded comments or sarcastic jokes. I wasn't sure if it was because she had taken my words to heart, or if she simply didn't want another public moment. But either way, I had made it clear that I was no longer willing to be the silent target. Later, after most of the guests had left and we were helping to clean up, my son came over to me. "I saw what happened earlier," he said quietly. "You handled that perfectly." I shrugged, trying to keep my tone light. "I just told the truth, that's all." But inside, I knew it was more than that. It was the first time I had addressed her behavior in the moment without relying on anyone else to step in. It felt like I had taken back something. I didn't even realize I had been giving away my right to stand up for myself without apology. As I was leaving, I passed by her mother, who was gathering her things. She glanced at me briefly and said, "Good to see you." There was no sarcasm in her tone, but there was no warmth either. It was neutral, and for the first time, that felt perfectly fine. I didn't need her approval. I just needed her respect, and if that meant she chose her words more carefully around me, then the point had been made. As I drove home, I thought about how different the day might have been if I had just stayed quiet. Maybe no one would have noticed the comment. Maybe the afternoon would have continued on smoothly. But I would have noticed. I would have carried it home with me, letting it chip away at the progress I had made. Instead, I left feeling lighter, knowing that my boundaries weren't just something I had drawn in my mind, they were real, and I was willing to enforce them. What I didn't know was that enforcing them once wouldn't be the end of it. The final test was still to come, and it would arrive in a moment so unexpected that the choice I made in those few seconds would define the future of all our interactions from that point on. The final test came not long after the barbecue. It was an unplanned moment, the kind you don't see coming until you're right in the middle of it. My son's wife had invited a few friends over for coffee and dessert on a Saturday afternoon. I had stopped by to drop something off for her that she had asked for some homemade preserves and a few herbs from my garden. I wasn't planning on staying. My intention was to leave them at the door and go, but my son insisted I come in for a cup of tea before I went home. When I stepped inside, the living room was full of chatter. Her mother was there again, holding court among the guests, her voice carrying easily across the room. She gave me a brief smile before turning her focus back to the group. I sat down near my son, sipping my tea and listening as they talked about everything from travel plans to new restaurants in town. For a while, it was all very pleasant. Then, as the conversation turned to hobbies, one of the guests asked me about my gardening. I started to explain that I had built a small greenhouse this year, something I was very proud of. That's when her mother let out a light laugh and said, "Of course, when you have nothing better to do, growing plants is the next best thing." It was almost identical to the comment she'd made at the barbecue, but this time it was in front of people who didn't know our history. They all chuckled politely, thinking nothing of it, but I felt my chest tighten. Before I could even respond, my son set his cup down on the table with a deliberate thud. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The room fell silent. Even the background chatter from the kitchen seemed to fade. He looked directly at his mother-in-law. "We've talked about this more than once, and it's over." She blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. "I was only joking," she said, forcing a smile. "No," he replied, "you were belittling her. You've done it before, and I am not going to let it slide anymore. My mother has always treated you with respect, and she deserves the same in return. If you can't do that, then you are not welcome here." The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth, perhaps to intervene, but my son held up a slight hand in her direction without taking his eyes off her mother. "I'm serious," he continued. "This is my house, and these are the rules. You will not cross them again." His mother-in-law's expression shifted from surprise to something harder, but she didn't argue. She picked up her coffee and took a slow sip, avoiding his gaze. No one spoke for several seconds, and then the conversation cautiously resumed, though it was clear the energy in the room had changed. I just sat there, silently absorbing the moment. It wasn't just that he had defended me, it was that he had done it without hesitation, without waiting to see how others would react. He didn't soften his words to make them easier to swallow or leave any room for misinterpretation. This was no longer about a simple comment. It was about drawing a final, unbreakable line. After the guests left, the house felt strangely quiet. My son walked me to the door, as he always did, but before I left, he paused. "I meant it," he told me. "You are not going to have to deal with that ever again. Not here, and not anywhere we are together." I felt emotion well up in my throat, but I managed to smile. "I know," I said, "and I'm proud of you." On the drive home, I thought about all the times I had sat silently through those comments, convincing myself it was better not to make a scene. I thought about the months it had taken for him to see it clearly and the courage it had taken for him to stand up, not just in private, but in front of others. And I realized something important. Sometimes, it's not enough to draw your own boundaries. You need someone to stand beside you and defend them with you. That day, my son stood beside me without flinching. And from that moment on, I knew I would never have to sit silently at that table again. Looking back, those months felt like one long, unwelcome test of patience, dignity, and family loyalty. What started as small, offhand comments had grown into a pattern that was only broken when boundaries were drawn and defended. I learned that silence can sometimes protect the peace, but other times, it only feeds the problem. Speaking up, whether it was me at the barbecue or my son in front of his guests, wasn't about winning an argument. It was about making it clear that respect is not negotiable. The biggest shift wasn't just in me, but in my son. He went from being a silent observer to standing firmly by my side, even when it meant confronting people he cared about. That changed everything. Families don't always agree, But when mutual respect becomes the rule and not the exception, the air gets lighter. And from then on, I knew that table would never be the same again. Thank you for spending your time on this story. If you enjoyed it, don't keep it to yourself, maybe someone else needs to hear it. Discover another true story by clicking on the left and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones.